Hi, I'm Judi Friedman, and today we have a wonderful guest with us. He's been a very big part of our organization, which is PACE, People's Action for Clean Energy. We're a statewide organization, and we're a volunteer organization, a charitable organization, and an organization that's deeply involved in hoping that we can improve the health and safety of the people of Connecticut. We're very, very interested in renewable energy, solar, wind, small hydro, and very, very interested in energy conservation, in energy efficiency, and very concerned about nuclear power and fossil fuels. As we all know, Connecticut has very high cancer rates and asthma rates. We have mercury pollution, and we're very concerned about these issues. But the energy that concerns us most from a negative point of view is nuclear power. The reason we're so concerned about this technology is that it affects unborn generations, thousands of generations. We are doing something that human beings have never done before. We're generating electricity for a very short time we're generating electricity for a very short time and generating waste that are alive for poisonous for thousands of generations of children. And what we don't know also is that these plants are aging and they could have an accident, a meltdown, old machinery fails. They're also perfect targets for terrorists. Today we have a wonderful guest. His name is Alexander Kuzma, and he's a lawyer. He's been very, very interested in protecting children and protecting people from the ravages of nuclear power. He's been a nuclear activist. Were you a nuclear activist actually in college?
That's when I began to get involved in the anti-nuclear
And
movement.
why were you involved? What was it about at that time that concerned you about nuclear power?
I mean, I think the greatest concern even then was the potential for a catastrophic meltdown, and also, even in the absence of a meltdown, the potential for major contamination through long-term storage of nuclear waste. I'd read a good deal about the problems at Rocky Flats and Hanford, Washington, the pollution of the Columbia River. And so that was when I first became interested in the potential for long-term devastation.
Today, so many people are worried about so many things. Mm-hmm. We have chemical spills, and we have our own budgets we're worried about. We have our own safety of our children. Why have you embraced this issue so much, not only in college, but then you were executive director of the Children of Chernobyl Relief Fund. Mm-hmm. Why did you take that job? Why are you choosing this issue?
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, it struck very close to home because my family comes from Ukraine. My parents were refugees during World War II and came here. I was actually in law school in 1986 when Chernobyl struck, and felt very disempowered because I felt that I couldn't really do anything at that time to respond to the problem. But very early on, I started hearing about the problems that were emerging in the wake of Chernobyl.
What problems were you hearing about?
Well,
this was early on. The accident was in 1986, and the problem was that people were not warned. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. And so they were exposed to a tremendous amount of radiation. And what did you hear at that time that upset you?
Well, I mean, Chernobyl released a massive amount of radiation, over 185 million curies, which is about the equivalent of 270 Hiroshima-sized bombs.
270 Hiroshima-sized bombs. Right. Was the amount of release from the Chernobyl accident in Ukraine in 1986.
Right, and this is not based on some kind of exaggerated or hysterical assessments. This was done by scientists at MIT and working closely with scientists that were at the site at Chernobyl in 1986, and then doing the assessments for many years afterwards.
So what were the first results of this terrible, terrible accident in Ukraine at that time?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there were immediately 34 deaths that occurred, but the bigger impact was centered on the fact that this massive amount of radiation was spread really all over the northern hemisphere. The first reports, as you might remember, came to the west from Sweden, which is about 1,300 miles north of Chernobyl.
Okay, so here's Ukraine and here's Sweden. Right. Ukraine here, and Sweden is 3,400 miles from...
1,300, about 1,300 miles
from 1,300 miles from
north,
Ukraine,
right.
And there were reports of contamination in Sweden.
Right.
Is that correct?
That's correct. And when those reports came in, you might remember that President Gorbachev denied that there was any major impact on public health, and for over a week after the accident was unfolding, there were attempts to get more information about that from the West. There was a massive cover-up that already began, and the worst crime, and it really was a crime against humanity, that thousands of children and young adults were told that they should participate in May Day celebrations that occurred in Kiev, in Minsk, in Moscow, elsewhere. And this was at a time when the radiation levels of radioactive iodine alone was over 100 times higher than safe levels. So you had thousands of children walking through the streets of Kiev, absorbing massive amounts of radiation.
What do you think, if we had an accident here, that we would be immediately notified about that accident? That was one of the problems. The people were not notified. They could not take the some precautions. Do you think we would be immediately notified if, let's say, Millstone had a meltdown or a terrorist attack?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would assume that there would be better notification than there was, let's say, in 1979 after 3 Mile Island. And there was already a good deal of anxiety and panic that developed. I think one of the basic things that needs to happen in the wake of any kind of an accident like that is to have a massive distribution of potassium iodide, which is a blocking agent for the thyroid gland.
Okay, you brought up a very, very important point that our listeners, I hope, will really, really take to heart. Let's say there is a nuclear accident or a terrorist attack. An important item to have in your medicine cabinet is potassium iodide. It will not prevent you from getting cancer, but it will help children, especially from thyroid cancer. Is that true?
Right. It'll help both children and adults. And there was a graphic example of that in that the Polish government, which was a little bit more progressive by the 1980s than the Soviet government was, they did distribute massive amounts of potassium iodide, and there were only 3 or 4 cases of thyroid cancer among Polish children. In Ukraine, there was over 2,000 cases.
Can you describe what the Chernobyl necklace is that some children wear?
Well, thyroid cancer, when it develops, it generally results in a fairly large tumor on the throat or on the neck, and it has to be removed through a radical surgery. And afterwards, there's usually a pretty noticeable scar because the surgeons have to go in and create kind of a crescent-shaped scar on the throat. And I've met a lot of the children that went through this. The problem is that those children will have to take throughout their lifetime hormone replacement drugs. And even in those cases, there is some risk of a recurrence of the cancer. Today, there are over 9,000 children in Ukraine alone that have precancerous conditions. And in Belarus, there was an even higher amount of thyroid cancer.
I'm very concerned about the notification issue again. The problem after 3 Mile Island was even that people were not properly notified, and that's in our country.
That's right. And
now, we'd say that's 1979, but after the World Trade Center was attacked, people were told to go back to their apartments and offices when it was not safe to do so. And that bothers me because lots of people are suffering and will suffer from being told that it was safe when it was not. So maybe we need to learn the lesson about evacuation and better or do something to stop the need for evacuation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are several points to be made about that, and one is that everything depends on wind currents in that situation. If you have a massive release of radiation like that, had the winds blown even slightly to the west as opposed to northeast, there would have been 40,000 deaths immediately, and that's according to representatives.
Why?
Because of the radioactive cesium, both gamma, alpha radiation. There were people living just 5 miles west of Chernobyl in a city called Pripyat that had about 20,000 people living in it. That whole population could have been wiped out in a very short period of time. And
Can you tell me what Pripyat, the city that where the Chernobyl workers live, can you tell me how that looks today? That's a city of what, 50,000?
No, it was about 20,000 people.
20,000?
It's a ghost town today. There's virtually nobody living there other than nuclear monitoring workers that have to go in and there are a handful of elderly people that have moved back to some of the villages surrounding Pripyat because they just couldn't adjust to living in the cities.
So that's
where
what
they were
New London would look like. For instance, the winds and rain were blowing a certain way from Millstone and we had a meltdown.
Right. I mean, if you're comparing the distances, the distance between the distance between Chernobyl and northern Sweden, where those first reports came, is about the distance between Millstone and the Hudson Bay. So you're looking at vast distances that would be covered by this massive radiation release. And even until recently, in places like Ireland still had dairy restrictions as of just a few years ago because of radioactive contamination from Chernobyl. In 1998, there were still restrictions on mushrooms and berries in the French Alps because of radiation.
Okay, now
content.
that accident is over. That happened in 1986, and the thyroid operation, everything. What's going on today? I've heard some comments about male sterility. I've heard comments about birth defects, and I'm wondering about those two and cancers. Are those legacies of the Chernobyl accident?
Right. In the Children of Chernobyl Fund, we feel that the accident is not over. The sealing of the reactor core has been completed. And even that's not completed very well because there's still cracks in that sarcophagus in the tomb that was built around the reactor.
So the reactor is still hot?
The reactors, there's still a lot of radiation in the reactor. There's still radiation that is seeping out of it in small amounts, but it's even being carried out by birds, by animals that are in that area.
And then they covered it, but it has cracks,
right.
And birds get in there.
Right, and there's still seepage coming out, and that's why the international community is still investing billions of dollars every year to build another superstructure over that existing sarcophagus that they hope will finally be able to contain that completely. But the health legacy of Chernobyl is still very, very severe.
No, I'm always very interested in water because water has certain. We can't control where it goes, and it goes where it will, and it does do things we can't see. Can you tell me about the water under this? Here's this reactor. It's still hot. It's covered with a sarcophagus. Tell me about what's under that reactor.
The reactor actually sits on the headwaters of the Dnieper River, which flows downstream to the Black Sea and provides drinking water for over 30 million people downstream. It's one of the most foolish places to build a reactor, but unfortunately, if you look at where a lot of reactors are built in this country also, they're either built on shorelines or on major rivers because they need cooling water. And Khrushchev, when he commissioned the construction of those reactors, they were finally built in the mid-1980s already under President Chernenko. They were built right on one of the major reservoirs that provides drinking water for Kiev. Now, at the height of the Chernobyl disaster, there were over 500,000 emergency workers that were brought into that site, both to put out the fire, to build that tomb, and also to dig shafts underneath the reactor core to protect the water from being contaminated. But in spite of that, as you say, there's no real surefire way of protecting the water tables, and there's a lot of sediment that's heavily contaminated. There's been plutonium detected already in the Black Sea area, so that radiation has migrated to various degrees, it's in the form of sludge. The immediate risk may not be that great, but the bigger effect is really with the soil contamination in a huge area. The 3 of the largest provinces in northern Ukraine are heavily contaminated, and 3 of the largest, about a third of the whole territory of Belarus is still contaminated. And what we're seeing there, for those of your viewers that have seen Chernobyl Heart, the Oscar-winning documentary that won back in 2004, there is a huge problem with birth defects. Chernobyl has now affected the grandchildren of Chernobyl, the women who were some of those school children that marched in the parades in 1986 are now having their own children, and we're seeing very severe chromosome damage, 9-fold increase in spina bifida in the province of Rivne. There's also Dr. Bill Novick, who was featured in the documentary, who happens to be a close friend of Senator Frist, who's also a cardiac surgeon. Dr. Novick detected a sharp increase in something called Epstein's anomaly, which is a very, very rare type of cardiac defect that has now become rather common among children in Belarus and in Ukraine. And he's done personally, he's participated in operations and surgical procedures to cure that. And we're seeing a lot of these problems. Some of them are pretty graphic, polydactylism, children that are born with extra digits. I personally saw with Shelley Sinland, who was a news reporter here from the Hartford area, traveled to the Chernobyl region back in the late 1980s, in the 1990s, and she actually documented a number of the birth defects that were showing up at that time, deformations, facial deformations, missing and distorted limbs, missing and distorted
We have a lot of problems, and a lot of people are talking about global warming now, and it's just frightening. I mean, there's really no argument. Most people are not arguing that there is global warming, that ice caps are melting, that glaciers are melting, that polar bears they're losing weight because their ice is disappearing, and water levels are rising. It's terrible, and as the waters rise, of course, our seacoast cities will be affected, nuclear reactors will be affected, and nuclear storage of nuclear fuel. But if global warming is such a great problem, is nuclear energy, in spite of its problems, is it an answer to global warming problems? Is it a technology that we should use to fight global warming?
I can't understand how any sensible policymaker can really promote nuclear energy as a solution to global warming when you consider the massive amounts of radiation that we're stocking into our environment. And everybody knows that's working in this area in the Department of Energy that Yucca Mountain, which is being touted as a long-term solution to nuclear waste, it's really a temporary solution. There's going to be radioactive migration from that site in just a couple of decades, and we're looking at a problem that needs to be resolved over the course of thousands of years. Just to kind of get a sense of how deadly some of these particles can be, just this week, we've been hearing a lot in the news about the poisoning of a former Russian KGB agent, Alexander Litvinenko, who was killed by a tiny particle of polonium-210. And that tiny particle has already contaminated the hotel, the bar where he was. The British authorities are now looking at serious issues with contamination with just tiny, tiny particles. We're not talking about tiny particles of radiation. We're talking about massive quantities of high-level and low-level waste that does contain plutonium, cesium, etc. So I can't imagine that we would be going out of our way to create, if we had a new source of energy that ran on arsenic or cyanide, I think it would be pretty foolish to promote that if we didn't have a long-term storage, and we don't have a long-term storage capability for these problems. What the public really doesn't know a lot about is the degree to which the federal government in this country and in France and other places has massively subsidized the nuclear industry. I mean, there are billions and billions of dollars that have been pumped into all of the most expensive elements of this technology, and they still have not solved the fundamental problems of reprocessing, decommissioning, etc. If we provided even a fraction of those kinds of subsidies to solar and renewable, I can't imagine that we wouldn't see a massive growth in the renewable energy, also massive job creation through that effort, so that it would be a tremendous economic boon of the kind that we saw during the high-tech boom of the 1990s. We need to be exploring, first of all, renewable and benign technologies before we start investing even more in basically a failed technology that still poses a massive threat. And the last concern is the one that you raised earlier about terrorism. Some of the public knows that Mohammed Atta, before he decided on flying the planes into the World Trade Center, was seriously considering a flight into Indian Point. And that, had that been a successful attempt, if they had decided to go for a more substantive attack as opposed to a more symbolic attack, we really could be looking at massive contamination of Connecticut and Massachusetts and a good part of New York, including New York City. We know that was not a remote possibility. Even if they had not been able to breach the containment building, which fortunately nobody's tried to do that yet, but if they had exploded, if they'd flown the planes into the spent fuel pools, we could have been looking at...
Can explain what a spent fuel pool. You have your reactor,
right,
and then you have a spent fuel pool. What is that, and why is that vulnerable?
Right. On the same site, they have to move those fuel assemblies that are highly, highly radioactive, and they have to move them out of the reactor once they're spent or becoming brittle, and store them on site. They have to store them in boron-circulated water that is going to reduce the level of radiation to some degree, but it's still highly, highly radioactive and is very difficult to move. So that those buildings are not that secure. They don't have...
You think a plane flying into that containment structure, like a large plane such as was used in the World Trade Center, could that cause a terrible accident?
Nobody expected those towers to be able to go down, and these containment buildings, they were built to withstand small plane crashes. They were not built to withstand the crash of a major jumbo jet. And if you think about the nightmare scenario of superheated jet fuel that's burning as it was burning in the World Trade Center, combined with the superheated core of a nuclear reactor, you're really dealing with a really frightening scenario. Something that is worth noting is that it was ironically an anti-nuclear activist and scientist, Dr. Amory Lovins, who recognized the risk of a terrorist attack on a nuclear plant long before 9/11. In the 1970s and early 1980s, he actually presented some of his findings, some of his analyses to the FBI, to the NRC, because he personally was concerned, as much as he was opposed to nuclear energy, he understood that the risk was so much higher that we needed to at least look at some ways of reducing that risk and hardening those targets so that they are, they're safer now, safer, but still not safe, as some of our federal officials like to say. So that I think the public in general needs to be a lot more sensitive to this issue and understand that we need to reduce the risk of terrorist attack, and nuclear power plants are unfortunately, they're a very attractive target.
Attractive target, and if one is concerned about global warming, if there is global warming occurring, then the temperature of the rivers rise, and the reactors need that cooling water. And if the temperature of the cooling water is rising, they can't use that water, and that would pose a great problem. That would mean you couldn't cool the reactor. So that's a very, very scary problem. Also, what many people don't realize is that global warming is caused by carbon dioxide emissions, and the building of the plants, the mining and milling of uranium, the transporting of the waste, all would contribute to fossil fuel emissions. So this is not a win-win situation. So what's the answer? You feel renewables are the answer? Energy efficiency, conservation?
Absolutely.
Can we do that? Are we capable, as I'm not going to say Americans, I'm going to say United Statesians, are we capable of doing this kind of severe turnabout?
I don't think the turnabout has to be severe. I think it can be very positive and really exciting from the point of view both of job creation and technical innovation. The United States already, we recognize that we're far behind the Japanese, at least Toyota, in developing fuel-efficient cars and hybrids. We're behind the pack. The United States should pride itself on being a technological leader. We're no longer a leader. In a few years, the government of Iceland is planning to create a totally renewable, non-oil-based, non-fossil fuel-based energy economy. If Iceland can do that in that kind of a severe climate, I think it would be downright shameful for the United States, with all of our solar capacity, with a huge part of our country based in the desert, in the prairie. We have ample access to solar. It would be disgraceful for this country not to invest in that. Most of the European countries have already invested heavily in mass transportation.
Yes.
And it's only now that we're facing this huge increase in oil prices that we're finally knocking ourselves on the forehead and thinking, well, maybe we should really be addressing this issue. I think the time is way overdue. And we're going to see that our economy will become more vibrant. We're already seeing that in the absence of any kind of subsidies for, well, not any subsidies, there are substantial subsidies, but we're seeing billions of dollars in profits that are now being made by British Petroleum that's invested heavily in solar and in renewables. I think
you're telling people if they want to invest their money, this might be a good place to put it.
That's where, the meager nonprofit earnings that me and my family have, we're investing them in.
That's
in,
wonderful.
In
and
some
invest
of
in
those
energy
technologies.
efficiency by changing light bulbs and lowering your demand and energy
Absolutely.
efficient appliances and all these wonderful things which do create jobs. You're totally right. And we really have enjoyed talking with you. And
Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful work. You've just been just a great mover and shaker on the Chernobyl issue. Alex, one thing I think is very special that you do is that you have raised money to help these children who are suffering more. And can you tell us about the funds that you've been able to help raise through your work with this is the Children of Chernobyl Relief Fund. It's a national organization working with Children of Chernobyl, which includes Ukraine and Belarus and parts of Eastern Europe. Right?
Primarily our group works in Ukraine. Our Irish counterparts from Cork County are working primarily in Belarus. But yes, over the last 18 years, our organization has raised over $55 million worth of medical supplies and technology, and we're working very closely with some of the major surgical centers and cancer treatment centers, pediatric centers in Ukraine. And I think the people of Connecticut have reason to be proud of the fact that this has really been a stronghold of our activities, and we've been able to create partner hospitals that have really improved cancer remission rates and infant survival rates among some of the newborn children that are born with various complications because of their mom's exposure to radiation.
Alex, I really have to commend you before this program ends too in facing these difficult challenges. Many of us go to work and we don't see the sights you've seen and must stay in your memory. And many of us even have happy jobs, and this is happy in that you're bringing relief to suffering people. But I'm very impressed with your ability to recognize suffering and work with it and not let it get you down, and keep working on it. And you're coming here tonight to describe what you've seen and share your firsthand witness account is very, 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 very helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's always, I think, as any doctor who works in the cancer field, you're always haunted by the children whose lives you weren't able to save. And, we lost several children this past year that I was quite close to. But I think we always take comfort in the fact that this technology that we've been bringing, whether it's an MRI or blood cell sorters or neonatal intensive care units that were the first of their kind really in Ukraine, and they came from the United States and from Austria and Britain, and now they're beginning to produce their own technology that's of good caliber in that area, so that we've seen tremendous progress. And so I'm a big believer in technology being used properly and being used constructively to save lives.
You're not a Luddite.
Never. I get very excited about what technology can do when it's used in the right way.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for
Thank you,
being
Judi.
with us.